room, Silk? This is not. Why don't you get to sit in the lazy boy? Why you got to sit in a regular chair?
I don't want to get too comfortable, Andy. If I get too comfortable, I might not finish the show, man. So I got to be about business. So how you doing? You always got the beautiful backdrop right there. Got your jersey hanging up in there. Retired.
It was never worn in a game because
it's clean.
It's clean. Well, the game it was made for was on AstroTurf, so it would have actually stayed clean. But no, it's you have to actually be good at football, and I was not. So yeah, my job was to let people throw me around like a ragdoll.
All-American at that.
I was great at it.
Oh man, well, Andy, we appreciate you you coming on to the show again. Good timing. Last week, today, you released an article called "How a Once Dominant College Football Program Fell Permanently 2 Steps Behind." Andy, I know a lot of people have read this. It looks like a lot of people on the Athletic read it. 240 comments. I'm sure the comment section is just full of good, common, just
positive affirmation.
Yeah, positive affirmation discussion.
Really, really good comment section at the Athletic for the most part. Like it,
company man,
it's healthy.
Yeah, healthy debate, robust. Yeah. It's not bad. I'm one of those, I was always a don't read the comments person, but since I've been at the Athletic, I actually do read the comments. And it was interesting because they kind of split a couple of ways. Like, people who aren't Florida fans were like, okay, cool. Thanks for telling us all this. And then the Florida fans were like, I wish you'd gone a little deeper. And the thing was, I mean, it was hard to kind of balance the two because you could write a book on how they got where they are now from when Urban left.
Well, Andy, we have some time.
Let's write that book now.
So I think, a lot of what the internet was saying about this article is that if you are a diehard fan, none of this stuff is surprising, right? You've heard all of this stuff. Yes. But if we were to dive into kind of a few of the biggest issues at hand, was it Florida's approach that was lacking? Was it the lack of desire to really go into debt for a long time? They really wanted to raise all of that money early on. What would you say are probably the 2 or 3 most important pieces that you feel, in your research, conversations, everything else, of why Florida did fall behind?
I think it was approached for a long time. You think 20 years worth of, we don't need all those fancy facilities. And it's basically, Coach Spurrier saying that, and then everybody in charge believing that for so long, even after Spurrier had gone on South Carolina and be like, no, facilities matter. That's a big deal. And so that part, and you mentioned the debt, that they were always very fiscally cautious, and there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But it also kind of underscored that Florida is not like, say, Texas or Texas A&M, where if you need some money, you just go say, we're raising money, come donate to us. Like, you got to work at Florida to get folks to write big checks. The same people tend to get hit up over and over again. And that doesn't, Gary Condren is a great guy. He's awesome. And I would feel so bad having to just go to him again and again and again every time something happened, or Gale Imran's a little bit older, but he was that guy for a little while. And I think more other schools have a few more of those folks that they can kind of spread things around with. I was talking to somebody from Texas A&M the other day, and they said generally there's about 20 people who can stroke the kind of check that makes something happen. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Florida's at that number, and I don't think there's a lot of schools at that number, but it's hard when you don't have as robust of a donor base. And so that's one thing Scott Strickland was hired for, was he was a very good fundraiser at Mississippi State, and Mississippi State doesn't have the donor base that Florida does, but he, worked and got a football building built there and had stadium improvements done and all that. So the idea was he'd come in and be able to raise more money at Florida, and he's had to, remember, to build the Heavener Center. Well, they were going to build it differently. And then Strickland, right kind of at the last moment, said, can we postpone this a little bit, move the baseball stadium, and then build it the way we really want to build it?
Because that started with McElwain, and that was going to be like a 3-story facility over in the corner by I think that's 2nd Street, and you weren't going to change anything. And that building was disjointed, and you were going to
Yeah.
have a weight room here and half a locker room here, and then the showers, and then coach's office. It was going to be a mess.
It reminds me of this house I looked at last time we were looking for a new house, where I walked in and the master bedroom was right next to the kitchen, and the kitchen was tiny, and it had this giant long hallway that didn't seem to do anything. Just took up.
In New York City.
This was in Newberry, Florida, and it was weird. I was like, "What? Who built this?" Like, that's exactly what they were. Nick, your point is correct. Like, they were looking at it and going, "Well, this is not that efficient." And the whole idea of this building is to create a more efficient environment. So that they changed that. They had to raise more money. It took longer, and that's why it took until 2022 to have it open. And so, I mean, that's part of it. I think other parts of it just decision making, and it's not always the administration's decision making. Sometimes it's coaches' decision making. Sometimes it's weird things have happened. I mean, so I there's so many little moments as you go through post Urban Meyer, Florida. You know, what if Will Muschamp came in and instead of saying you got to be able to fit the power to beat the University of Florida, had said, I'm going to go with some of these new offenses that are driving me nuts as a defensive coordinator. And he doesn't hire Charlie Weiss, and he hires somebody who's a little more forward-thinking offensively.
Like Brent Pease.
Not Brent Pease. But
like Kurt Roper.
Not Kurt Roper. Well, maybe Kurt Roper. Maybe Kurt Roper from day one would have been okay.
Yeah.
But somebody, in that vein, but he wasn't going to do it. But if he'd done that, he might still be the coach at Florida. If Jim McElwain, when Will Grier gets suspended, if Jim McElwain says, we want you still here, because that whole situation, it seemed to me it was fairly mutual that both parties agreed that Will would do better off somewhere else. What if the coaching staff had said, no, we want you to stay here. Mm-hmm. We want you to be the quarterback here. And when you come back after game 6 next year, we're good.
Yeah, I really think, Florida has had obviously a lot of things in their control that they were behind on, right? Facilities, some of these recruiting staffs and extra.
Yeah, the staffing thing's another money allocation thing that we haven't talked about. But Will Muschamp got told no on that. Jim McElwain got told no on that. Napier's the first one that's gotten like a full yes.
Yeah, and you start to look at it, right? You have the Will Grier situation. You have the credit card scandal. You have a lot of things that are just like these once-in-a-generation type of incidences happen.
You wonder why all this gray hair, staff, Dan, huh?
Right, yeah. Nick had black hair. When
I remember.
Covering the
I had jet black hair when I was a young, fresh-eyed journalist starting on this beat.
But you think about, after Urban Meyer leaves, Will Muschamp is the coach in waiting at Texas, probably the hottest assistant coach in college football. Jim McElwain, maybe not the right fit culturally, but doing really well at Colorado State, comes from under Nick Saban. Before that, is recruiting pretty well before he gets fired. Could have had probably an amazing recruiting class. We'll never know what that could have been.
Jamar Chase signed.
Say what?
Jamar Chase.
Yeah.
Like before Jim McElwain imploded, they were going to get Matt Corral, Jamar Chase, and probably Kyle Pitts.
They had Kyle Pitts in the boat. So they were going to have Matt Corral and the Chase. The LSU people say they would have gotten Chase all along. But Chase,
and maybe so, but there was a lot of other names names are escaping me right now. And then Dan Mullen, a guy that brought Mississippi State to #1, comes back to Florida. It doesn't work out. It's all of these kind of weird situations where you're like, oh, that should have worked. Well, if that didn't work, then this should have. Well, if that doesn't, then bringing Dan Mullen home, that should work. And now we find ourselves in a situation where Florida has 2 6-win seasons in a row. I think they'll be probably pretty lucky to get more than 6 or 7 this year. How much of it is what Florida could have done versus how much of just what happened in Florida? You just have to be able to deal with adversity and overcome.
Well, the Mullen thing is so weird because that's when I have a hard time pinning it on the administration, other than maybe saying, hey, look, there's a higher standard you have to recruit to.
Mm-hmm.
But the coach being good and successful and then changing his mind about what he wanted all of this to be and deciding, I want to be an NFL coach. I don't know that you can control that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the strangest thing is it's another kind of weird Florida thing. Like, COVID happens, Dan Mullen mentally becomes a different person, and all of a sudden you're in a weird spot. Now, the thing is, how would the Dan Mullen tenure have worked out had he not suddenly decided he wanted to be an NFL coach? I don't know that it changes the end result, because ultimately they were still going to have this massive talent gap with Georgia or with LSU once Brian Kelly got there. And I think they were still going to have the same problems. But, you know, it's yet another thing that it's so hard to explain, because it feels like other programs don't have this sort of weirdness happening to them over and over and over again.
I want to ask you back to like the donors and, you know, the boosters. What's normally the culture of the programs that do have a lot of boosters and donators when it pertains to football control? A lot of people that donate money may want some say-so, depending on what they're given. So what's normally the culture around college football and boosters and donating and all that?
It depends on the place. So like Texas has been one over the years where people feel like, I give this much money, I therefore deserve a say in things. And it's caused problems. And it's even, they're trying to deal with their NIL situation because they don't want anybody going rogue in the NIL space, because they want to make sure they have a unified philosophy. But that's stuff they've worried about. But then you've got Ohio State, where Gene Smith very much in control as the AD. They have tons of big donors, but they almost counterbalance each other, where, you know, Gene's like, I'm in charge, keep giving us money, trust us that it'll work. And they keep delivering a product that works. And that's what you want. And now Florida, for the most part, has always had a situation where the AD's been in charge. The donors have not had outsized influence on it. And then the thing is, like, I imagine y'all have met Gary Condren, who's Florida's biggest donor at the moment. Gary is not the kind of guy who's going to go in demanding things. You must do this. I fire this. He's not that guy. He just wants Florida to be good. And he trusts the people in charge to make that happen. And you want people like that. You want a lot of people like that. The problem is Florida doesn't have a lot of people like that, because they don't have a lot of people who are willing to donate at that level. Alabama has more. Georgia has more. Texas has a ton, but they want to medal. Texas A&M has a ton. They used to medal more and don't medal as much.
Auburn big medalers.
Texas A&M's problems feel more like in the football office than outside.
What do you mean? You mean a coach with a king's ransom who can just kick his feet up on the desk and say, "Please fire me"?
That would be an issue. That would be an issue.
I would love to get fired if I were Jimbo Fisher.
No
I would do
doubt.
everything in my power.
There's no offset to that. So, like, imagine he gets fired after this season and collects like $76 million and then becomes West Virginia's coach.
Right.
It's like double dipping.
Just gets to go home. He can literally buy half the Appalachian Mountains.
So what we see with college football is today is pretty much a money game. We see what Bama spent, and we've seen what the uptick in Georgia's always spent well, but we've seen the uptick when Kirby got the job. You can see the money being spent everywhere. We could come up with a lot of things. We talked about the coaches and, you know, some of the ones they wanted with staff size that they didn't get, but a lot of it just comes down to money. How does Florida fix that money problem?
Well, you got to keep trying to find more big donors, but I don't think Florida has a huge money problem, because they have a decent enough donor base. They have a big stadium that they tend to fill. They have the SEC TV contract, which is about to pump in some more money. So I actually think they're fine on that front.
Spending it.
They are spending it. And in fact, they might have to rein in the spending a little bit, because this is an unusual place for them to be in right now. But they're spending it. They might need to spend it a little more efficiently, but I think they're okay on that part. Now it's just a matter of get the players that Georgia wants, get the players that Alabama wants. You are now spending in a way that they are spending. Your facilities look like their facilities. You just got to get them, and
that's money too, though. Andy.
That's all exactly.
And
now that's NIL, but that's using NIL efficiently. So we don't have a big sample size, but I think we've seen enough in 2 years to know that the way NIL works best is if you give the most money to the best players, the ones who have already proven that they are the best players. Like, I think there's a thought out there that you can sort of tilt the scales in recruiting and get some guys you wouldn't normally get by offering a bigger bag than somebody else. But I think there's a problem on the back end of that, where your players who have already proven themselves, they go, why are you giving that to that guy who hadn't done anything yet? And so there's your issue right there. And you look at the schools that are doing it, like Alabama and Georgia and Ohio State have a prohibitive advantage here already because they don't necessarily have to offer as much up front because they can go, look at all the first rounders we make. Because that is still the most powerful recruiting tool there is. We just made a bunch of first rounders. You could be the next one. And that there's more money in that than there is in NIL. And so they don't have to be as aggressive up front as these other schools do. The problem is, how do you get in that club? And so that's where Florida is at right now. You got to beat some of those schools for players. And I think if you look at who Florida's actually coming down to now, like as finalists, it looks a lot different than 2 or 3 years ago.
For sure.
You know, you look at those graphics that On3 or 24/7 puts up, and it's, we're crystal balling this guy to Florida. And his second, the other percentage choice is Georgia or is Clemson or is somebody like that. That's not what we saw 2 or 3 years ago. Like, that's how you get back in this.
Yeah, Dan Mullen came in and won with Jim McElwain's players, and year 4 came, and you saw what his X's and O's looked like with his Jimmies and Joes. I think Florida is just in a place right now, and is down in a place right now, and we didn't realize how down Florida was, how down the roster was when compared, because Florida could be the 10th, have the top 10 recruiting class in the country and be 5th or 6th in the SEC, 4th in their own division, 3rd in their own division. So you're not competing with just the nation. You're competing against the SEC, which is going to have Alabama, Georgia, Texas A&M, Tennessee to a degree in that top 10. You're competing against those guys and chasing Georgia.
And if you do the top 100 count, it can get ugly. I think I did it in the story for the Dan Mullen era, and it was like Florida had 15 top 100 signees, and Alabama had like 40, and Georgia had like 38.
Which year did Alabama have 15?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I mean that's what you're dealing with, and I do think it's more difficult now than it was, say, when Urban Meyer got to Florida and then put that 2006 class together, because the best players tend to cluster more. It's like the NBA super team thing. And that was starting in the late aughts, and then really picked up steam last decade, where we're all going to go to these schools, and it's going to be Ohio State, Georgia, Clemson, or Alabama. And that's it. Or maybe LSU. And I'll be curious if NIL does change the dynamics of that a little bit, because I think you did see some guys who would have clustered, who maybe did say, I'll go here. But again, like I said, the other side of that argument of you just hand out the biggest bag to the recruits, the guy who will take the biggest bag is probably going to be more of a problem than the guy who's willing to take a smaller bag but go to the place where he wants to be developed into a first rounder. That guy who wants to be developed into a first rounder is thinking ahead, is probably less likely to just bail on you, sees the big picture a little better than the give me the big bag now guy.
Yeah, and you know that they can be bought, right? So there
Right.
can always potentially be another bag out there that's a little bit bigger. Just to highlight what you said earlier, Dan Mullen signed 15 players in the top 100 from 2018 to 2021. Nick Saban got 42 and Kirby Smart got 40. So, I mean, just it's going to be very, very tough to win and win consistently.
You just need a longer recruiting season, I think.
That's right.
It's just too short.
I did Dave Waters' podcast, and I meant to ask him about that, and I forgot. Like I meant to ask him about asking that question because he could not have thrown Dan Mullen a bigger softball.
It's unbelievable. The 2020, Dan Mullen was really affable with us. Would stay after we talk about his son's golf and talk about all kinds of stuff after media. 2020, Dan, they're like. The Zoom interviews did him no favors.
Yeah. It's a strange dynamic. That whole like that. There's a book about that year to be written, just because it's so strange. And I had somebody it was actually multiple somebodies who were there that said basically when Mullen did his new contract but didn't do anything for the very long time assistants that had been with him at a lot of places. Didn't do anything to extend their expiring contracts that they knew it was done then. And that was like April of that year of 2020.
Well, maybe save Florida some money in the buyouts. Andy, want to ask you. So Florida's obviously had, since Urban Meyer's left. So since 2010 to now, Florida's now on their fourth head coach. And there's, still question marks that a lot of fans have about, is this the right fit? Is this the guy that's going to be able to get Florida over the hump? If you're playing athletic director and let's just say your coach is Willie Napier, right? So we're talking hypotheticals here. What are you looking for in progress beyond just wins on the football field to be able to evaluate, or else you're then going on to coach number 5 and what would probably be 15 years?
I don't think anybody's going to hear this at Florida, but I actually think there's a good model to look at in Tallahassee. Look at how Mike Norvell's tenure has unfolded, because it's a similar situation where he got hired right after a firing that was expensive, and there's no way to fire him after 1 or 2 bad seasons. Like, you had to give him time. And what you've seen is with that time, he's built a better program. He's fixed a lot of the problems that he inherited. And, you go back to his 2021 season, they weren't great by any stretch of the imagination. Like, they were down in Gainesville playing for bowl eligibility and lost, but they fought that entire season. They got better, it felt like, as the season went on. And that felt like, okay, these players believe in him. They believe in what he's doing. They will fight for him. They're not going to quit on him. That's a huge thing. So let's say in this season with Billy Napier, if Florida's sitting there at 6-6 at the end of the season, but they're fighting their ass off in every game, win or lose, and you see that the young players are, like, let's say Andy Jean and Eugene Wilson turn out to be the best receivers by the end of the season, like, that's a very positive sign. That's an arrow pointing up. And that's what you're looking at, because Florida is not going to fire Billy Napier at the end of this season for a bad season, because they would owe him $31.8 million, I think, something like that. That's not a buyout Florida's going to pay. I can't imagine the University of Florida ever paying that kind of buyout. So
outside of some Hugh Freeze-esque scandal,
you'd have to have a scandal. Well, then you can fire somebody for free. But that's a different story entirely. But I don't foresee that happening either. I think it's going to be a season that will be challenging for Florida fans, that they're not going to enjoy, because they're not where they want Florida to be.
It's a nice way to put it.
But the way to evaluate it is, as the season goes on, you get into the back half, even if the results aren't necessarily breaking your way, what is the product on the field look like? Is it getting better? Are the young players the good ones? Are they fighting? Are they not quitting? That's the part that matters in this situation, because that should give you hope that with another good recruiting class or two,
and to me there's a scale, like the scales of justice. Okay, if Florida's 5-7, what does what do those young players look like?
Right.
What does the recruiting class look like?
Mm-hmm.
Are you getting absolutely boat raced by Georgia?
Right.
Do you lose at home to Arkansas,
Mm-hmm.
which would piss fans off? So
Correct.
to me, there's a balance. What does it look like? I don't think Florida's not going to win the SEC East. They're not going to win the SEC. You need to have realistic expectations. But what swings that and balances things out? A top 3 recruiting class? Do you need a top 5? Where do you I think there's so much of an eye test on the field.
I think if you're in the top 5, be happy, because at that point it's really just how do you develop them? Alabama's had more number 1 classes than Georgia, but I think we can agree that Georgia's developed its signees better than anybody recently.
Their staff turnover is better as well at Georgia. They have more lately.
Right, consistency.
Consistency in that remark.
Yep. So I think that part, you look at that and see, are the young players developing? But I think you're right, Nick, that there will be a point at the end of the season where we can look and say, all right, should everybody be optimistic, or is this all there is? But we don't know that right now. I do suspect, I think actually probably signing day will tell us that, because they'll have just played Florida State. Signing day will come, assuming that's when DJ Lagway puts pen to paper. He seems like a true believer in this staff. And you kind of have to have one or two of those who can Pied Piper the other guys. And you don't know if he's going to be good or not. Like, 5-star.
Yeah, I know. I know.
But,
a little bit, Andy.
Well, I will tell you, the way he acts, the way he carries himself, it certainly feels like he's that dude wherever he winds up. So, and he certainly seems to really love Billy Napier in Florida. So if that's the case, that's reason for hope.
Yeah, I always thought when the hire was made, I thought it was a long-term hire. Regardless of what I think happens this year on paper, schedule-wise, nobody's going to be judging or ready to fire Billy Napier off of this season. I like your Mike Norvell take. I think
don't say nobody. I moderate a message board. He's already.
But people that matter.
Be wanting to fire him. The money will not be there, so don't worry about it. He's not going anywhere.
Yeah, the people that actually matter. I don't think they're going to be looking to fire him, because this was always a long-term play. If they wanted somebody to come in and do a quick flip, they would have hired a veteran coach like Dan Mullen when he came in. But this was a talent acquisition and a long-term play for us to be able to get high-end recruits and change the culture. I don't think we ever did a full reset since the Urban Meyer, which was a very toxic era. I don't think we ever did a full rebuild. This is the actual full rebuild. And I think it's a long-term play. College football, I think, in the grand scheme of it all, is flipping with head coaches. The whole scene is flipping. So it's new, younger faces that are going to be, the face of college football in 5 years from now. Saban, I think, is going to be gone. You see what's happening with Jimbo Fisher out of Texas A&M. All the older guys that we know, the older names we know. I mean, even Kirby, he's a newer name, even though he's high.
47. That's a problem.
Right. He's going to be around a long time. Yeah. But that's what you're competing with. He's top dog right now. You need somebody. You're aiming. You're not going to take Georgia down or knock him off his pivot or Kirby off his pivot in a year or two. This is a 4 or 5 year thing. Lagway is a good. That's my barometer. When Lagway gets on campus as a freshman, you got a couple recruiting classes. You said Andy Jean and Eugene Wilson; those guys will be on campus. They have plenty of weapons. I like what we're doing on the defensive side of the ball. I like to see what the DC does, but in the trenches, linebacker wise, you can see the uptick in talent.
Yeah, they're better on the D line this year. And I mean, you want to make my ears perk up. Like, tell me your team's better on the D line.
Yeah, I just seen a picture of Will Norman that got me super excited. Pause, but he's looking like, because the D tackle room is already flipped. But if you got freshmen like Will Norman, that's going to be
Kelby Collins.
Kelby Collins, guys
they seem very, very excited about, and he's one you go out to practice and you look at him and you're like, oh, he looks different.
Right.
Andy, one of the things that you had mentioned about Mike Norvell and kind of what Florida State's doing is very different than what we've seen from a lot of what the top programs have done. His recruiting has been even worse than Florida's recruiting has been over the last 3 or 4 years. They filled a lot of it through the transfer portal.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're not seeing Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State really play a lot in the transfer portal unless it's able to grab, 1, 2, 3 of the top players on the market, right? Jabbar Gibbs, right?
Mm-hmm.
You think it's a sustainable model? Do you think for Florida, for the sake of Billy Napier, and obviously they've had to use a transfer portal more than those other programs have, but do you think that that's a sustainable model to build for the future? Or is it really built around high school recruiting? Because that's the one chink in the armor I see about Mike Norvell is obviously this year's recruiting class is going okay for them, but they've consistently been in the low teens to be able to compete in the SEC. Compete in the ACC, obviously.
But that's the difference. That's where it's different. To compete in the SEC, you have to be able to develop the guys out of high school. You have to be able to get the top high school recruits and develop them. You can get by in the ACC doing it this way. Now, I think what Norvell ultimately wants to do to compete for national titles is use the success in the transfer portal to prove, as a proof of concept of here, we can win here. And then you can go get better players out of high school, which you're seeing. There's an uptick in that. But to compete in the SEC, to compete for SEC titles, you have to draft. You have to win through the draft more than free agency. And no, you occasionally have to get good free agents. Like Georgia this year, they got Missouri's best receiver and Mississippi State's best receiver. That wasn't an accident. AD Mitchell, everybody's like, well, AD Mitchell left for Texas. What's Georgia going to do? No, they recruited over him. Like it's cutthroat, baby. You want to keep winning natties there. You've got to keep going. But that's what Florida has to build through the draft, which Billy Napier seems to be trying to do. And I know there's criticism of him not flipping the roster as fast. And I've asked questions about that too, because I wonder why, I watched Lincoln Riley go into USC, hired in the same cycle, and flip that roster very quickly. Now, he had a quarterback coming with him that he knew was special. Florida had a different situation where they had a quarterback that they knew was special, that they inherited. That's going to be an interesting one too. Like watching Anthony Richardson develop, that will reflect on Billy Napier one way or the other, whether he succeeds in the NFL or not. Now, I don't think we're getting an answer to that season 1. It sounds like the Colts want to play Gardner Minshew and kind of bring Anthony along slowly. But if Anthony's great in the NFL and Florida's still struggling offensively,
not good.
That's a bad deal. If Anthony goes in the NFL and flames out,
I don't necessarily agree with that because is he gonna ball like year 1 with the Colts? Then I would judge Billy Napier.
Then you judge very harshly. But
if they get 3-4 years to develop Anthony Richardson, you can't look back at Billy and say,
"Oh no, not 3 or 4." I'm talking about year 2,
right?
Which is probably when they're gonna play him. So but the other thing is, if Florida has a competent offense, and look, there's no guarantee. I know there's a lot of negativity around Graham Mertz, but Graham Mertz was a very highly respected, highly recruited quarterback coming out of high school. He's the highest rated quarterback Wisconsin ever signed. We don't yet know if that was Graham Mertz or if that was Paul Chryst, kind of taking his hand off the till at Wisconsin, because there's a lot of arguments to be made that Paul Chryst kind of let recruiting go. They changed philosophies a little bit. It didn't work. So let's not dump it all on Graham Mertz just yet. Let's let him play a little bit at Florida before you judge what he.
What are you hearing? What are you hearing
Mertz
about Graham
mania?
Mertz?
That he's a competent quarterback who can run this offense. I'm not gonna oversell it.
I said he was on our message board. I said Graham Mertz is fine.
There you go. And
they did not like that.
Is he more likely to be murder Mertz?
Take another quarterback in the portal.
Misdemeanor Mertz.
Yeah. Is he more likely to be murder Mertz or misdemeanor Mertz?
Misdemeanor Mertz.
God. But the thing is, they looked at what was available, and I realized, listen, I have friends that went to Florida who text me about this stuff all the time. Like, who should we get in the portal? And I had one who texted me, said, should we go after Chance Nolan? And I just texted back, listen, if you can get the guy who would have been Oregon State's third string quarterback, you really have to try, don't you? I mean, that's what it is. It's like, oh, the next guy is going to be our next guy. No, don't mess with the chemistry in your room unless you're sure there's somebody out there who's a better option. And I'm not sure there was anybody. Like the best QB transfers this offseason probably were Sam Hartman and Devin Leary.
Mm-hmm.
And Sam Hartman, I think Florida was looking at him. I think Auburn was looking at him. He wanted to go to Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
He picked Notre Dame. And wouldn't you? They've got a first-round offensive tackle on the left side. They have a definite NFL offensive tackle on the right side. All 5 of their offensive linemen are going to play in the league. Like, he's never played behind a line like that before. So if you're him, you're looking at that. I got 1 year. I want to improve my draft stock, but I also want to win some games. That's the place you'd probably pick in that situation. The Devin Leary thing, listen, that may wind up being a really good thing for Kentucky. We'll see, because he was great at NC State. Then he got hurt. Don't know what he's going to be like on the back end, but they've got the offensive coordinator back who was there for the better Will Levis season in 2021. And Liam Cohen's the guy's name. Mm-hmm. We will see if they get better. Their offensive line was not particularly good last year. So if they don't fix that part, I don't know that it matters how good Devin Leary is.
And you know we're running up against it. Oh, go ahead, Sil.
Yeah, it's probably my last one. I don't want to hold you too long, Andy. But what do you think about the quarterback play in the SEC East, SEC altogether? I think everybody, or I know everybody's flipping quarterbacks. We have Mertz, but everybody's changing.
Yeah, it's interesting because like Spencer Rattler looked great the last couple games of last season, but he's got another new offensive coordinator. We don't know how good he's going to be. Joe Milton looked amazing in the Orange Bowl, but we've seen Joe Milton at Michigan and the first time around as Tennessee starter. So which guy is he? Alabama's a mess. Like, they didn't like anybody they had, so they went out and got Tyler Buckner.
Say that one more time. I haven't heard that in 15 years.
I just mean in the quarterback room.
Well, no, just say
they're fine everywhere else.
And no, we need to clip it and put it on Twitter,
They just got Alabama's a mess. Oh boy,
right there.
It is.
Let's go.
I appreciate it on YouTube short right there.
Just flame on. No. But they are in the quarterback room. Would you have expected this from them now? Like, they got 4 top 100 guys at quarterback on scholarship, and they get out of spring. They're like, I guess we'll grab another one. So, Jaden Daniels, I thought had a good end of the season at LSU. It felt like the turning point might have been that Florida game. And Garrett Nussmeier, his backup, looks like he could be pretty good too. So LSU feels pretty stable. Connor Wegman at Texas A&M, I really like. It's just, what about all the rest of it? The guy who I think could be really interesting, and I've been beating this drum for a little while, is Carson Beck, because he's been waiting around. He got beat out by Stetson Bennett 2 years ago. Yeah, he just said, I do radio with Aaron Murray, and Carson told Aaron Murray, hey, I wasn't ready to start at Georgia. But instead of transferring and just going somewhere where he could start, he was like, if I hang here, I might only be a 1-year starter at Georgia, but I could be a 1-year starter who goes to New York for the Heisman ceremony and winds up in a good spot in the draft, because he's going to have a ton of weapons at his disposal. That offense is going to look a little bit different. Darnell Washington being gone, you're probably not running as much. You're playing a lot more you're playing the same amount of 2 tight ends, but they're spread out a little more. So the quarterback's going to get a little more to do. And that dude, he's the right size for the NFL. So if he has a big year, it could be a really good year for him.
Final question, Andy. I know you got to run here soon. Article that you put out, how the Florida-Georgia football rivalry game could have to move from Jacksonville. I guess the contract runs out this year, but there's an opportunity to extend it for maybe 2 more years. I know Jacksonville's talked about doing some stadium improvements, whole city improvements, hopefully during that time as well. But what do you think is, if you're prognosticating what's going to happen to that Florida-Georgia game?
It's interesting because I just assumed if they're tearing down the stadium and rebuilding, because they're doing that to keep the Jags. Let's be clear here. I've had people say, why are they? Is Florida Georgia that important? I'm like, they're doing that to keep the Jaguars, because if their lease runs out in 2030, and if they don't like the stadium, they're going to leave. So that's why they're doing it, and it's going to cost 2 years of the Florida Georgia game. The question is what happens. And my assumption was you just put it on campus, just like they did in the 90s. Talking to some people at both schools, I was not really aware of how much money they make in Jacksonville. It is essentially the take of a home game every single year for both teams. So If you go home and home, it means each school is giving up essentially a game per year of revenue, or one of those years they're giving up a game's worth of revenue. So about $6-7 million bucks. And so I wouldn't be shocked if in those 2 years it's away from Jacksonville, it gets shopped to Atlanta, Orlando, Miami, Tampa. And if it winds up at one or more of those spots, the price for Jacksonville goes up to get it back.
I like being able to move it around like that. I don't mind going to Atlanta, Tampa. Tampa's very close. Orlando, that stadium is a little meh.
All I've heard is Silk saying he'd rather go anywhere else but Jacksonville. We've been preaching on it for years.
It's all about how you frame it, Dan.
You can't leave Jacksonville to then play in the Citrus Bowl.
Camping World Stadium.
The only money they've put into the Citrus Bowl is to change the name and the signage.
What if you're leaving to play in a stadium with a pirate ship, or to play in a stadium where you can get a Chick-fil-A sandwich for $2.50?
I'm firmly in the camp of play it 2 years in Jacksonville, and then rotating, one in Gainesville, one in Athens. Then you get, if you're at Florida or Georgia for 4 years, you get the full experience. You play in all three places. I don't get playing it in Tampa.
Well, you're gonna have to write a check for like $3.5 million to each school.
Well, Disney's cutting all of the SEC schools very large checks for the next decade. So I have a hard time feeling bad for the presidents and athletic directors at Florida, Georgia, who are like, oh no, we're going to lose $3 million. That's cool. You're getting an extra.
That's a lot of money.
12. You're getting an extra 12 from your team.
In real life, that's a lot of money.
You got $3 million laying around. Like,
no. That's why
Red Nick over here. No, but it's just a drop in the bucket for his paycheck.
The TV money that's about to change is it's just funny money that they're playing with now. So the money, the difference of losing that one home game is nowhere near the amount of money you're going to be getting from ESPN compared to what you were getting from CBS.
But you could also get that and $3.5 million.
Right.
Gordon Gekko, greed is good.
You know, it's better than the SEC ESPN contract. The
Not
SEC
much.
ESPN contract,
Jimbo's contract,
$3.5 million.
That's true.
The SEC ESPN contract, $3.5 million and a ham sandwich. Also better.
And the Chick-fil-A $2.50 joint.
Hey,
that too.
I guess you still got to pay Dan Mullen. Keep that game in Jacksonville.
Exactly. What is it? Once a year for 6 years?
Yeah.
Since they fired him.
July 1st. It's Christmas in July every year in the Mullen household.
He's living it up. Well, Andy, we know you got to go, my friend. It's a pleasure chatting up with you. Again, we'll have to do it before the season starts, but just remind everybody, if they don't know, where they can follow you and read all of your great articles.
So I'm at The Athletic. You can go to theathletic.com, sign up. Also, The Andy Staples Show, wherever you get podcasts, costs you nothing. Also on YouTube, The Andy Staples Show, if you want to look at my ugly face while I'm talking. So that's where you find me.
Andy's broadcasting in 4K, it looks like. Great webcam there you have. Andy.
I just got back from a jog. I look like I'm crying because I'm sweating. So.